We are a loving community of diverse beliefs who support each other, and our doors are open to anyone who wishes to join. Whether you're a longtime member or a new visitor, you're welcome to join us here electronically and in spirit. My name is John Kim, and I'm a member of this fellowship, leading here for only the second time ever, as any member may. I'm especially happy to welcome new members today in our ingathering ceremony, which I myself went through just this last December. Now, Reverend Ferguson will light our chalice from the sanctuary on Brewster Avenue.
Hello there, I'm Reverend Brian Ferguson. I serve as the minister here at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Redwood City, and I want to wish every one of you here a good morning and welcome to this beautiful day at this difficult time in our nation's history. I now invite you to join me in lighting the chalice. I will light the chalice and then join me in the chalice lighting words, which will be displayed on the screen. Take from life its coals, not its ashes. From the flames of love and justice, join hands and hearts in common endeavor, and there will be no limit to what we can achieve together. I invite you now to join me in the spirit of meditation. These are the words of Reverend Dr. Rebecca Parker. Your gifts, whatever you discover them to be, can be used to bless or curse our world. The mind's power, the strength of our hands, the reaches of our heart, the gift of speaking, listening, imagining, seeing, waiting. Any of these can serve to feed the hungry, bind up wounds, welcome the stranger, praise what is sacred, do the work of justice, or offer love. Any of these can draw down the prison door, hoard bread, abandon the poor, obscure what is holy, comply with injustice, or withhold love. You must answer this question. What will you do with your gifts? Choose to bless the world. The choice to bless the world is more than an act of will. It's more than an act of moving forward into the world with the intention to do good. It's an act of recognition, a confession of surprise, a grateful acknowledgement that in the midst of this broken world, unspeakable beauty, grace, and mystery abide. There is an embrace of kindness that accompanies all life, even ours. And while there is injustice, numbing, and evil, there moves a holy disturbance, a benevolent rage, a revolutionary love, protesting, urging, insisting that that which is sacred will not be defiled. Those who bless the world live their life as a gesture of thanks of this beauty and this rage. The choice to bless the world can take you into solitude to search for the sources of power and grace, native wisdom, healing, and liberation. More, the choice will draw us into community. The endeavor shared, the heritage passed on, the companionship of struggle, the importance of keeping faith, the life of ritual and praise, the comfort of human friendship, the company of earth, its chorus of life welcoming each of us. None of us alone can save the world. Together, that is another possibility waiting. I invite you to join me in silence. Blessed be, and amen. I'd like to invite our worship associate, John Kim, now to give his reflection.
Thank you, Brian. Today's service is reflecting on where we are now in history. In my personal history, I became a full member of this fellowship last December. Since then, over the course of 2020, a lot of things have happened. Feels like the world has gotten worse. Between the pandemic, the wildfires, and a host of other problems, it's often felt like we're in a unique crisis. But then I think back further, and where are we in the wider perspective? In my personal history, I was born 50 years ago in January 1970. At that time, Nixon was president, the Cold War was on, the Vietnam War was raging. In spring of that year, our country began a bombing campaign in Cambodia, adding to the existing bombing in Vietnam. These wars were causing enormous devastation with many thousands of civilian casualties each year. Our military was also dropping some 2 million gallons of Agent Orange each year, causing even more devastation to the environment and people of Vietnam. Our own environment in this country was largely unprotected. There was no EPA, and pesticides, including DDT, were used freely. Students protested across the country, often violently. We've seen protests, but this year, but in May of that year, soldiers fired live rounds at student protesters in Ohio, killing 4 of them. In the wider world, even greater atrocities were happening. In China's Cultural Revolution, in Nigeria's Civil War, and in repression behind the Iron Curtain. There was even a worldwide pandemic ongoing then. It was the second wave of a new flu strain first seen in 1968 called H3N2, or the Hong Kong flu. And the human impact was huge, still costing 1 to 4 million lives worldwide, but little was done to stop it. Almost no one wore masks or social distanced at that time. So, how are we now compared to when I was born in 1970? Where am I in the wider picture of history? Though 2020 has had many trials, I feel that the world has progressed a lot since my birth. We're facing a new pandemic, but we're doing much more to fight it and help each other through these times. We wear masks, we distance ourselves and pitch in. There are still wars and violence in the world, but they're smaller and more local than what we saw in Vietnam. We know more about the damage being done to the environment, and we're doing more to fight it. It doesn't mean it's enough, but there is progress. My son was born just as the new millennium started in March 2000. He's 20 now, just starting his senior year of college. I'll be helping him move in later today. I think often about the world that he's going into for a life on his own. I spend a lot of time studying surveys, population studies, looking at how all of our lives are changing. I'm a continuing student of and advocate for science. But what especially calls to me is that the more that I learn, the more how I see that the world really is changing. We still have many problems, but people have made a difference, which has made the world a better place.
Thank you, Mariana. I'd also like to thank Mariana, Dawn, and Larry for blessing us with your music this morning. Don't sleep through the revolution. That would seem like good advice generally. I'll come back to that statement in a few moments. But that song that we just heard, The Times They Are Changing, from Bob Dylan, he wrote that in 1964. And it still seems apt today, like many great songs, like many great poetry, poems, like many great lyrics do. They have almost a timeless quality to them. And then that 4th verse, it says, and this is directed to parents, but let's say it as those of us who are in the older generation. Now, I define older as everything a day older than me and above. So I'm still in the younger generation. But the older generation is, your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend a hand, for the times they are changing. So it presents with you a choice. Things are changing. Get out the way or lend a hand. That's your choice. And back in 1966, and a lot seemed to happen in the 60s, and we often think of it as a pivotal moment in history. In 1966, Martin Luther King spoke at our Unitarian Universalist General Assembly at the Ware Lecture, which is one of the biggest lectures that we have in our movement. And we've had many famous speakers, Nobel Prize winners, and people like Martin Luther King speak at it. And the title of his talk was "Don't Sleep Through the Revolution." And this was in 1966. And this is he delivered to Unitarian Universalists. And Martin Luther King was very, very familiar with Unitarian Universalists. He educated in Boston, where he was surrounded. He used to attend the Arlington Street Church. And I remember reading an interview with Coretta, his wife, who said that they considered becoming Unitarians for a time, but he did not think he could reach out to the African American community and do the work within our movement. And I think we're thankful that he didn't, because I think what he achieved was significant. And it's sad to say he may not have been able to achieve what he did if he'd stayed within what was and sadly continues to be predominantly, not solely, but predominantly a white congregation. And he gave this "Don't Sleep Through the Revolution," and he talked about it. He knew he was talking to progressives and liberals who supported him. He remembered Selma when 300 Unitarian Universalist ministers went down there. He remembered James Reeb, who was murdered, a Unitarian minister who was murdered in Selma. He remembers Viola Luiso, a lay worship leader who also was Unitarian and was murdered down there as she ferried some of the protesters back and forth. He remembered our involvement in Selma, which we are rightly proud of. And yet, 2 years later, he said, "Please don't sleep through the revolution." Because he remembered that the Civil Rights Bill had passed, but he knew there was work to be done. The law had changed, but the culture had not changed. And he recognized that, and he needed everyone to continue the work to shift the culture, to change people's opinions, because we changed the law, but there was still the work to change people's opinion. So don't sleep through the revolution. The revolution is not about changing the law. The revolution was about making sure the law was implemented for everyone, especially those people of color and those historically marginalized at that time. And in it, he talked about the story of Rip Van Winkle. Some of you may be familiar with that story. It's an old story from the early 19th century, and it's about this Dutch-American villager who he's walking up the hill and he meets these people that you're not quite sure, the kind of mysterious folks, and he imbibes in their liquor. So don't take drinks from strangers. It's one of the lessons from this. But he falls asleep and he wakes up 20 years later. And there's some subtle things in that story, because when he goes up the hill, outside the inn, there's a sign of King George, the British king, prior to the American War of Independence. But after waking up 20 years later, he comes down, and George Washington is in the picture of the inn. He had slept through the revolution. And he gets down there and he was asked about how did he vote, and he didn't even know what people were talking about. What do you mean, how did I vote? He said, "I'm a loyal subject of King George," he says. So if you sleep through the revolution, you miss out on a lot. I think perhaps more importantly, if you sleep through the revolution, you don't influence the outcome. And Martin Luther King, in this speech to the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly in 1966, said, "One of the great misfortunes of history that all too many individuals and institutions find themselves in a great period of change and yet fail to achieve new attitudes and outlooks that the new situation demands." Those are the words of Martin Luther King. And I remember when my daughter was younger, when she was at a worship service, and we were having a question and answer with, it was my lay worship leader at the time, who was a history professor. My daughter asked him, "What's the most important time in history?" And this history professor answered and said, "Now. Now is always the most important time in history, because we can influence, only now can we influence the future while being aware of the past." So Martin Luther King asks us, both as individuals, as a religious community here, and as a wider religious movement, are we willing to change and achieve the new attitudes and outlooks that the new situation demands? And what does the new situation demand? There seems to be four crises, I think we're facing, but I really want to address three of them right now. Of course, there's the ongoing climate change that we need to address. There's a greater awareness, it's always been an issue, but there's a greater awareness about the larger aspect of the population, about the racism within our criminal justice system. There's, of course, the COVID pandemic, and perhaps the one that I think is really coming up as a fundamental issue in the next few weeks, which I think could be a pivotal moment in our history, is the preservation of our democracy. I'm generally not an alarmist, but I'm really worried about what's going to happen after the election. We are so used to in our country that we vote, the votes get counted, and whoever wins, wins, and whoever loses will leave without. Disappointed, yes. Hurt, yes, but they honor the result. And I think there's a legitimate fear that that may be in jeopardy this time, and I have a legitimate fear, and I hope I'm wrong. And I think it might be a time for action. And I invite us all to reflect on that. Are we willing to take action? Now, like many of us, I get very excited when I hear someone in the radio or someone in the television talking about Unitarian Universalism. And Arlie Hochschild is a sociologist who explores the social impact of emotion. And she's got a fabulous book called Strangers in Our Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right, where she went and lived and talked to people in Southwest Louisiana because she wanted to understand people who were differently from her. She sees herself as a liberal and progressive. And then she was on an interview in NPR on Being, and she talked about her parents being Unitarians. So I perked up and was quite excited. But then she went on immediately to say when she was 16, she left the Unitarian movement. This was in the 1950s, because we felt we were just a bunch of talkers. And she became a Quaker as a teenager because she believed Quakers were doers. And of course, I was a little deflated. I was hurt and disappointed and a bit angry about that. But you can't really argue with others' experience. And so I think there's a lesson to be learned. Are we willing to be a community of action? And I think of the justice things we've done with the LGBTQ work, with the environmental work, with what we're doing now here at UUFRC and within our religious movement of getting out the vote. And you the vote. And we've done work in immigration. There's a lot of things we've done work with. But are we doing enough action? And are we willing to do more in the coming future? I know many of us are working really hard to get out the vote. And that will end when the election happens. And I think we'll be called to greater action to preserve our democracy, to make sure every vote counts and every vote is counted. And Martin Luther King was praising of our action during Selma. And he also doesn't want us to sleep through the next revolution. And I think we cannot sleep through this after the election. And James Luther Adams, who's one of our foremost Unitarian thinkers in the 20th century, He had an awakening when he visited Nazi Germany in the 1940s. Or 1930s, I'm sorry. This was when Hitler was rising in power. And he remembers going to some of the more liberal progressive churches in Germany who really absorbed the culture. And he really became concerned because he remembered standing in the sanctuary where he would see pictures of Adolf Hitler and Jesus in the chancel behind him. They had absorbed the culture, but they had absorbed some of the unhealthy aspects of Nazism. And it was the more conservative churches who were grounded in the Bible, who were grounded in their values, that kind of resisted Hitler to the greatest extent. So there's always that danger in liberal religion that when we absorb the surrounding culture, do we absorb what is life-affirming, life-sustaining, and life-enhancing? Or are we sustaining stuff that's thwarting life? And we always have to be careful of that discernment. And that's why one of our principles is the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. It needs to be a responsible search that's grounded in our religious values. And James Luther Adams said this. He said, the prophetic liberal church is a church in which persons think and work together to interpret the signs of the times in the light of their faith, to make explicit through discussion the thinking that the times demand. The prophetic liberal church is a church in which all members share the common responsibility to attempt to foresee the consequences of human behavior, both individual and institutional, with the intention of making history in place of merely being pushed around by it. Now is a time where we need to take the common responsibility with the intention of making history. How do we wish to do that, both leading up to the election and after the election? Can we engage our common responsibility as a religious community here in Redwood City and a wider movement throughout the country to work together and do our part to tip history in a more life-sustaining, life-affirming direction? I know many of us have been focused on the upcoming election and getting out the vote, and that's incredibly important. And the next step is making sure those votes get counted. Every vote gets counted. I feel that might even be a more important, the time post-election might be even more important pivotal point in history than the lead up to the election. And politics is so easily to get disillusioned about. I look at the millions of dollars spent in the campaign, spent on advertising on television and the internet, and I reflect on that profound religious thinker who you may know better as a musician, Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa said, politics is the entertainment division of the military-industrial complex. Politics is the entertainment division of the military-industrial complex. And I think that's quite important. It's funny and it's important at the same time because politics, I think, can be a huge distraction from these core values, these great things that we really need to be paying attention to. And it can be this distraction from those other areas that we desperately need to be paying attention to. And we've got this important confluence of circumstances that are arriving right now with the election, the pandemic, the ongoing climate crisis, the rise of the awareness around racial injustice in our criminal justice system, and this threat to democracy that I think many of us feel is coming together through this election. And all of this will need to be addressed regardless of who wins the election. And I feel we need to be part of the organization to make sure that our democracy functions both leading up to and after the election. And there's been many problems leading up to it, and there will be more problems after it. And I want to let you know about an organization that Unitarian Universalism is involved with called Choose Democracy. And Choose Democracy is an organization that acknowledges that democracy is fragile And we have reason to worry about the use of power in thwarting the election. We also know that we as people can defend our democracy, and there may be need for non-violent mass protests to stop a hijacking of this election. An election works because people honor the result. And if people don't honor the results, what we may need is millions of people out in the street in non-violent mass protests to delegitimize those who may try and thwart the election. And that's why Unitarian Universalism as a movement, and I hope we as a community, and I know I as an individual am committed to supporting Choose Democracy, making sure all the votes are counted and prepared to take to the streets if I feel the election results are not honored. And here's the pledge they ask each of us to make. We will vote. We will refuse to accept election results until all the votes are counted. We will non-violently take to the streets if the election results are thwarted. If we need to, we will shut down the country to protect the integrity of the democratic process. That is grounded in what I believe to be Unitarian Universalist values, the use of conscience and the use of democratic process, both within the congregation and society at large. And those of us with more power and privilege need to use our power and privilege to center those voices of the historically marginalized. Take leadership from those who are younger with different perspectives and experiences, different racial identities, and different ethnic identities. As the times they are a-changing said, are we willing to get out the road? Are we willing to get into this new road and take leadership from a new generation of leaders, from a new identities of leaders? I think that would be living into this moment in history in a life-affirming and life-sustaining way. Are we willing and able to do so? Together, I think we can. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Don. I want to invite everyone to join us for the fellowship time after the worship service. We'll have a time where we'll have a couple of breakout rooms where you can get to know each other in smaller groups as well as the larger group. I'd like to thank everyone involved in the worship service today. There's many, many people. It does take a village to make these services online, and thank you to everyone for their contributions. We'll now extinguish the chalice. Please join me in the words for extinguishing the chalice. They're on your screen. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. We do live in a pivotal point in history. We don't know what's going to happen in the next few weeks, but I invite each of us to consider, how do we want to engage in this time? How do we want to live into this moment, this potentially pivotal moment in history? That is a choice each of us has, and we need to do it in a way that is meaningful to us, that is grounded in our values as a religious community. And how we engage this is more important to engage as a community than as individuals. And it's more important for our community to engage with other organizations to amplify our individual, our community power to make a difference in the world around us. I do want Unitarian Universalism to be a religion of action. I do want Unitarian Universalism to be active in doing our part in changing history for the better. We have in the past, we have an opportunity now. Whatever happens in the election, the world needs us to bless it with our gifts. Go with love, go in love. Blessed be, and amen.